Hello and welcome back. We are having a bit of a little special episode tonight. Oh, that's not the right one we want. This is the one we want because we're taking a little bit of a break from our regularly scheduled D&D to a bit of a try something new. We're calling it behind the idea behind or behind the scenes, whatever we decide on eventually when we settle on a name. Where we just go through some of the stuff we've designed for the campaign. We go through some of the stuff we like about D&D, some of the stuff we don't like, and we just kind of get into the bit that happens behind the role play. Maybe that's what we go for, behind the role play. But we're starting tonight with a little look at one of our favourite characters, Geronimo, played by Jake, who obviously is here to talk about the character. We're basically going to go through some of the stuff we do know, some of the stuff we don't know, ask some questions, find out just some stuff with regards to Jake and joining in with D&D, because I believe, Jake, you first played kind of tabletops with me, didn't you?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll go through some of that, and then well, hopefully we'll do some more of these in the future, and we'll throw them up on YouTube just because we can. And this will also push us hopefully into affiliate, because pretty much all we're missing right now is some ticked boxes. So we're going to get that done. But we'll start pretty much with the character Geronimo, Jake. And firstly, kind of like, how did you come up with Geronimo? Like, this is a question, I don't know, I ask a lot of players whenever they're making characters, but do you find it easier to start with kind of something from D&D, like the rule set itself? Do you like find a class you like or a mechanic, or do you prefer to come up with a story and then build around that?
I definitely came. I think it was definitely the class mechanic that I came up with first, because I remember distinctly when we were talking about campaign 2, when we were doing our first campaign, I was thinking, like, because the first character that I did, at least for when we first stepped into D&D, was a Hexblade warlock, and he was, kind of much more serious, and I was trying to make him kind of like a bit of a charmer, a bit more of a sort of charismatic character. And I thought, let's do something like quite interesting and fun, something that's sort of like so just at different ends for it. But I wanted to play an artificer basically first of all, and that's kind of like where it came from, the idea of being some sort of engineer, some sort of mechanic, I guess, is sort of where it kind of came from. So yeah, I guess I started with the class kind of fantasy first, and then it sort of built up from there.
No, that's sometimes a really good place for people to start. Like a lot of people I've spoken to who really put like the role play and the story forwards as like the main reason to play D&D, we're some of those people that probably agree with that, almost seem to sneer at the idea of building a character in the rule set and then building around it. But I actually think I'm quite similar to you in that I find, like, I really like some of the rules and the ideas and the mechanics that you're going to be playing, because playing the game is part of it. And then around that, you can take kind of the nuances of the gameplay and turn it into something much more fun. As you said, you liked the idea of the engineering thing. It led you down this kind of quirkier idea than you had before.
Exactly.
Yeah. With the character, though, obviously the personality doesn't just come from the rules or your own imagination. Everything's inspired from anywhere. And Geronimo has something of a, shall we say, an imposing personality. He's very large. He's very brash. Where does kind of the inspiration for that come from? Because I would say he definitely stands out in the party. Not in a bad way. Obviously, we like these unique characters and these personalities. But where did that originate from?
It's funny that you mentioned about like kind of things developing, because I feel like the personality of Geronimo started off at a point and then just developed from there. Like, he was definitely meant to be comic relief, and most of it came from the idea of me wanting to do a voice, because obviously his voice is this sort of like New York, sort of Brooklyn, I don't know where it's from, like some sort of New Jersey. Oh, it's New Jersey, yeah, New Jersey sort of kind of New Yorky sort of harsh accent that kind of mimicking goblins from World of Warcraft. And that was the point where I started, because I wanted to be sort of like, mechanic gnome that builds stuff. And I think one of the first ideas I came up with him was inventing the first ever gun in the world. I think, didn't you call it Edoras? Is that's what
Edeneris is the world we're set in,
it.
and when you were designing the character, you definitely said to me, like, you want firearms to be part of it. But in the previous campaign, we hadn't used firearms or gunpowder. It was something I kind of veered away from. But with you wanting to run an artificer at 100%, I was definitely up for working with you in that. And you came up with the idea, in fact, of bringing in like the first gun or the inventing of it as something your character would do. And I thought that was a really cool idea. So yeah, we ran with that.
Yeah, I really like that. And then I basically, from that point onwards, it set this tone I think, for him just coming up with wacky, stupid names for things. Like, for example, Gun is Geronimo's unliving nozzle, and Gun is what's the abbreviation of the words, the acronym of
Yes, the acronym,
Geronimo's of Geronimo's unliving nozzle. And then from there, we got Tank, which is terrible and
nasty
something.
killer.
Yeah, that's it. Terrible and nasty killer.
Yeah, terrible and nasty killer. Yeah.
Yeah, so we've got stupid names like that, and that kind of like built into Geronimo's personality, especially in the same way that he would always be giving people names. So like most of the characters in the party have a special nickname. So for example, Durgus was Bigsy, Barrand is Smallsy, Brandon is Hatsy, and Natara is Goggles. And as time has progressed, those have changed as well. So, for example, once we got the ship and Durgus became the captain, he went from being Bigsy to being the captain, and that's just all Geronimo calls him now. So stuff like that, and that kind of just started to flesh out basically an idea of that Geronimo, like, despite being an intelligent character and quite clearly very creative and stuff, he can be just very whimsical and just a bit sort of crazy, and just like in his mind, just always a bit sort of just like just different and sort of like on edge. And when I'm trying to play him, I'm thinking like, okay, when I let him sort of loose, it's sort of like, okay, what would Geronimo say in this instance? He'd probably say something quite wacky and kind of just off the cuff and just sort of, I don't know, just a bit sort of like, you know, like a friend that sort of like is quite funny but just doesn't have or understand social cues or like, you know, where the line is that much. And that was kind of like something that I quite enjoy about him, and that's sort of where it fleshed on really and kind of developed over time.
Yeah, that total kind of lack of a filter, really restricting you in what your behaviors can and can't be, and allowing, as you mentioned, this kind of comic relief as well as this wackier outburst. It's interesting you talked about, though, kind of going from the idea you had and how that's developed as we've played, because we're at session, I think we've just had session 25, so we'll have 26 tomorrow. So we've been playing, with us playing weekly, we're looking at 5-6 months now of playing the campaign. And obviously the character we had at session 1, first level, is very different to the one we've got now, which is natural. Do you find, though, that you prefer to develop your characters, and in particular with Geronimo, have you found it easier to kind of leave him with some gaps and some holes in the character that you've been able to fill in based on what you've enjoyed playing? Or did you have kind of a lot of these ideas right at the very beginning and they've just morphed as time's gone on?
Yeah, I think definitely the latter one, because with Ashton in the previous campaign, I left everything open, totally open-ended. And he went from being this kind of like sort of more sort of like trying to be charismatic to end up being sort of like kind of a bit more serious and whatever. And Geronimo was kind of the same in the sense that like I thought of him a certain way where he was like really, really whimsical. But as time has progressed, like, and he's obviously cared more and more for the party and the others that are around him and met family and stuff like that, he's gone from being just pure comic relief and just craziness to having a little bit more of a serious edge, especially when we're talking about stuff. Like, I know that Geronimo has, and also different morals as well to myself, which has been interesting in the sense that, like, whilst he's a very good person, Geronimo also wholeheartedly is probably a little bit of a coward underneath, and so will actually try and just protect his own neck a little bit. So in instances where, like, I think one of the big ones I remember is when we were considering whether we leave the children inside the pods or we get Aurello Spine out, and knowing full well that if we didn't get Aurello out, there was a huge chance that this Banshee was going to absolutely rinse the entire party, versus obviously the lives of the kids. And I think maybe Natara and Brannon were a bit more like, oh, we should probably look after the kids. But then Geronimo was very fervently, and which is nothing I would have done in any other of my previous characters, was like, it just felt right to me at the time that he was like, no, we need to get Aurello out, because if we don't, bad things are going to happen to us. And at this stage, we just go warn the orphanage. We just don't want to die, guys. So there's no way. Why? Let's not give up our lives for nothing, kind of thing. So it was very different.
That survival instinct that, as you mentioned, perhaps your other characters didn't have, because they fell more into that classic hero archetype where, you know, every villain needs to be slayed, every problem needs to be overcome.
Yeah, exactly.
It's interesting you talk about kind of the different perspective of your character, especially to yourself, and those kind of moral values, because obviously for everyone who pretty much isn't part of the group, you and I met and started role-playing on a different platform. We started with MMO role-playing, doing some Evil Bastards elsewhere, and a huge part of that role-play was putting ourselves into the boots of characters with very, very different moral values. With that in mind, do you find that an enjoyable part of role-playing? Like, for you, is it a nice thing almost to try and experience a different perspective of life? Or is that more just something that's come about from trying to imagine someone new?
I think I like it. I mean, if I didn't like it, I probably wouldn't do it, because I think what's interesting and what I love about roleplay the most is the idea that you're inhabiting something that isn't yourself. It's why I hate playing humans in any fantasy setting. Doesn't matter what it is. I couldn't possibly play a human because I am one. And in my mind, it doesn't matter what fantasy setting, like maybe there's differences in D&D, like you can do anything in D&D, but I just feel like in any settings, it feels too much like a human-y kind of thing to me. And whilst Ashton, before my previous character, was Yonti and seemed human and acted very human, the idea of him not being that and having some other aspect of him that wasn't just a human thing was enjoyable for me. In the same way I love playing a gnome, because when I'll be talking about things, like I'll be speaking from like a height of like 2 feet something, or like something smaller anyway, and I'd be like, Geronimo looks up, sort of like something I'm personally as a 6'2" human male never actually tends to do in real life. So it's very interesting, kind of coming from that perspective and sort of doing different things. So I think, yeah, like morally speaking, especially when I'm definitely a goody two shoes IRL. When I play something that's sort of like a little bit more off that sort of side, or a little bit skewered in terms of what I normally play, there's definitely something interesting about it, because it's sort of like you're trying to empathize with a character that is very different to you, and there's a sort of like psychological interest in that. Sort of like I find it interesting, because you've got to essentially come up with decisions that you wouldn't normally make. And like I said with Geronimo before, like it's a very different sort of style of like trying to think out problems. And my initial impact would be, we'll figure out what the Banshee's doing, and we'll find a way to stop it. Let's save the children. Now that'd be my original one, but Geronimo is like obviously has a different side, and that's interesting for me, because it's not what you'd normally do, and against the norm trope and sort of characters are interesting in general, I think.
No, absolutely. And with obviously those different responses, sometimes you have the solution to a number of those problems. I'm drawn immediately to a number of instances in fights or battles where, in particular, the Eldritch Cannon mechanic of being an artificer tank in our setting has been deployed in his healing form, and that's been used to act as, in some cases, kind of a last-ditch survival buff that's managed to keep people on their feet, pick people up when they're on the door of death. Some really useful kind of clutch moments with those character mechanics. Was it the kind of tank, or this it's part of the artillerist set, isn't it, that you have? Yeah, was it this that drew you to Artificer, or is there any particular mechanics in there that you've really, really enjoyed?
Honestly, I think the thing that drew me to Artificer the most was the idea of crafting your own gear, like and like enchanting stuff, and like actually like spending the time doing that, like making like magical items was something that I thought was so cool, because all I was imagining was like getting to a certain stage when I could do the infusions, like for example Brannon's hat and Durgis's weapon, like return throwing axe, like all of those mechanics that help aid my other party members, especially Durgis in this instance, because the axe would not return, and it gives it a +1 too. I thought that was insane. I loved that idea. So all of the infusions that I get to do are really, really cool. What drew me to Artillerist was maybe a bit more of a gamer moment, because I thought that it would be really nice to have. I think one of the big things with Artillerist and Artificer and a lot of other classes is that they don't have much to do in their bonus actions. So in my head, I was thinking I'm going to be a caster, because I think Artillerist is more of a caster in the Artificer role. I want to be a caster, but I don't want to have to be like standing around doing nothing with a bonus action. I want to be able to do stuff similar to what I was doing with Hexblade Warlock. And I just like the idea of sort of like on my bonus action, I could basically have either a Force Ballista, so something that does a lot of damage and knocks people back, Flamethrower, so big AoE damage, or Tank in support mode, which is basically just giving temporary hit points, and obviously being able to revive people when they're downed, which I think is a personal mechanic from you.
So that's something we've got with the injury and healing rules that I use, because there's other ones that I don't use. It's just kind of a way of making going down a little bit more dangerous.
Mm-hmm. That has just only added to that, but it was mostly the infusions for me. I thought the infusions were incredible. I love that idea.
Yeah, and that's something we haven't really gotten onto yet with the campaign. Like, it's obviously something I want to do, because, as you mentioned, kind of one of the foundations around Artificer is this idea that you can use your infusions, you can create magical items, you can kind of bring these toys into the world to allow others in your party to grow, and including yourself, have some really, really interesting things going on. But it's not something we've really gone into with too much depth thus far. But obviously with the ship, with that kind of home base, and with travel allowing plenty of in-game time to pass, even if sometimes we skip over quite large distances, it obviously opens up a lot of doors for you to create these big projects that, you know, down the line can really snowball into some fantastically fun things to bring to whatever we're doing in those moments. With obviously all of that going on, how do you feel the character and the class has fit into the group dynamic? Because I always insist when parties are created, not necessarily that they be balanced in that kind of traditional dungeon crawler or MMO sense, but I ask for some variation. I ask for some kind of flavor and some differences there. How do you feel that Geronimo fits into that kind of weave that is the party?
Well, I think he fits in really, really well, because one of the big things is we don't have a dedicated healer. And whilst Geronimo isn't a healer, both him and Natara do have a sort of support function, and he's definitely like the big supporter of the group. Like, we've got big damage dealers like Baron and Durgus and Brannon, and then I think Natara and Geronimo are the big supporters. And I played a big damage dealer last time in the last campaign, so kind of moving to more of a support class, I think he fits in really, really well. Like, having tank in support mode is big. Having some healing options, just being able to like mend stuff, augment armor, augment weapons, just makes him the ideal kind of supporter, because I like playing those sort of classes, which is something that leads on to, you know, what I do in MMOs and stuff. Yeah. I like being that sort of support, sort of like a half damage, half support class, and I think that's really, really fun. And I think he fits in really, really well from that. I think I'm glad I chose Artillerists, because it works well with our party dynamic.
Yeah, and I would agree pretty much wholeheartedly with all of you. I've obviously been really happy with the party dynamic. I kind of took the liberty of final say on everything when it was said and done, but you guys came up with something amazing, and Geronimo is one part of that really nice blend of different ideas. With the campaign in general, though, obviously we've hit a kind of a break point on the main storyline. I may not have mentioned this on the stream or anywhere recorded before, but basically how I'm treating the plot is we're kind of breaking it into chapters. D&D doesn't inherently do this outside of ritual modules, but other systems like Call of Cthulhu really are based around this idea of chapters, similar to books or films. And we're kind of at the break point between two chapters. We've just had the death of Arello, the first kind of main antagonist that we met right the way back in the first episode. We have some loose ends we're trying to kind of close up, which are a result of the direct actions taken by the players. And then we have a route outwards to kind of the beginning of our next chapter, in pursuit of this thread of other cults, other things to do with the kind of the evil that seems to be rising in this world. Geronimo himself has run through this plot essentially hunted. We took another system from a Star Wars TTRPG to do with kind of obligations and things that were tied to these characters at the very beginning, and I've been rolling them in secret and having them kind of build up slowly over time. Geronimo's was that he obviously had his bounty, and we found out maybe in first or second session that he has a very large amount of money on his head, and he's being hunted by this extreme professional. How have you found the kind of being hunted, and also what do you want or what do you look for going forwards with that plot? Because if it's just a character that turns up every few sessions to hunt you, that will eventually get tiring.
Honestly, he's the most terrifying adversary I've ever fought against, and I've not even fought against him. I've run it. Like, I say this to the guys, I've said this obviously off stream and everything like that, but Reginald is, I think Geronimo has the worst obligation, because Reginald is fucking terrifying. Like, he is actually just so terrifying. The fact that he just hits so damn hard, and the fact that when we first met him in episode 2, I think it was, he literally just walked up and was like, oh yeah, I'm hunting him, like, I'm giving you a little bit of a head start, I just wanted to be very polite, instantly made me think, red flags, this guy's terrifying. I like it was just yeah. I mean, for Geronimo, as I said before, he's a bit of a coward. So the idea of something hunting him is always on his mind, and he's always like very wary. I like the pace at which he's there. Like when he appears, it's like groundbreaking. We are on action station. And obviously, as we get higher and higher levels, like we might have enough confidence to do it. But honestly, at this stage, I think because of the way that he's affected us since literally the second episode or one of the early episodes, early sessions. Sorry, it would. I don't think we could get to level 10 and still be terrified of this guy, even though we're sort of like halfway to godhood almost. We'd still be terrified. Because it's just something ingrained in the characters, at least in the roleplay sense. So in my mind, like him turning up, he's only turned up I think twice now. But he is. I honestly, I don't think I'd ever get bored of him turning up because when he turns up, it's always at the worst fucking moment and always at the worst times, and it's just terrifying. So. In my opinion, I like it when he turns up because from a story sense, it's really interesting. But at the same time, I find him really scary. I mean, I've said this to you multiple times. I would love for him to get so involved in the storyline that he gets so frustrated with not being able to catch Geronimo that he eventually like sells his soul to whatever like demonic cult thing we come up against next, and like he just becomes like some sort of like devil hunter, and we've got to kill him because he's that so he's lost his patience. He's gone from being the cool guy to being that sort of like, I don't know, sort of.
It's an evil from an obsession. I think that is a really nice idea, and unfortunately I now can't steal it directly because I don't look original enough. But I think it's really interesting what you say with regards to when he appears. There's like immediate action stations because I do roll for these obligations turning up, and so. I think part of the reason it always seems to be an inopportune moment is there isn't really ever a right moment for a bounty hunter to turn up who has proved in the past that at least currently he's still able to whoop people quite easily. But I do like the level of pace and anxiety that it creates within the party because pacing in D&D is something that is really difficult to get right sometimes. There is a very easy trap to fall into of becoming bogged down and mired in certain very mundane tasks, or players becoming distracted by threads that don't really exist where players see them. It's red herrings, except there weren't any herrings to begin with. And so characters like Reginald, and even from the beginning this was part of his kind of creation, were intended to kind of clap their hands and chiver you along and get you moving. Have you seen Jumanji, the original one with Robin Williams? Do you remember the hunter from Jumanji that comes out? Mm-hmm. That was the first inspiration for Reginald. The first inspiration. As soon as I saw that there was a bounty hunter for you, I was like, who's it going to be? And I was just drawn to this hunter who just wanders around wherever they are in America, just attacking Robin Williams whenever he can.
Yeah, I honestly think that's a great cracking idea, to be honest. I think I can see it now. I can actually see it now. I think it's interesting you mentioned that because like it's as a move on for storyline. I think that's really good. That's what I think feels so awesome about him, is that he does actually just push us along. And as I said, we'd probably be at level 10, like at some sort of like almost godhood level of power, and we'd still probably like Geronimo would be like, I don't want to fight this guy. This guy scares the living crap out of me, even though he could probably like, I don't know, build some sort of like monstrosity tank version that can kind of like blow up a whole world or something like that. He'd still be terrified of him. So.
Yeah. No, and that is the effect I guess long-term NPCs have, especially when they build up that kind of presentation of themselves. But obviously, the story around Geronimo can't just be he's being hunted. There are other plots there. We mentioned with the emergence of Reginald, you kind of had to face your background very quickly, which was that Geronimo had been basically exiled, or he'd exiled himself from his community because he had basically broken the law. Gun was an invention that he had designed for this, in his mind, evil corporation that he believed they no longer should have access to, and in taking it, he broke the law and was on the run, and thus the bounty emerged. The bounty hunter itself, I mean, it could be the whole plotline, but I don't want it to be. What other things do you want to see kind of tied in there with your character, not just being chased? Where do you see the resolution of that? Where do you see other parts of his background coming in?
Yeah, honestly, I love it. Like I've said this multiple times. I love it when like backstory comes in. Like even with Kazi coming in, his cousin or some sort of cousin-ish. Like I'm going to call her his cousin. It's basically
Without getting specifically into the real minutiae of it, she's basically a cousin.
You're basically a cousin. Well, even that kind of like was like awesome. Like the idea of like Geronimo coming back and forth like to this one tavern to visit his cousin, who's basically almost like a prostitute in this brothel, and a whole interaction with the old lady that would laugh at him at how short of time he'd take and everything like that, and the respect that was given at the end from the last session, which was insane. It was just felt so good. Like it was just a nice, genuine Geronimo interaction with an NPC that was sort of different to his sort of like usual sort of candor with his party members and just the sort of like the discussions he'd have. It was really interesting. So I'd love to go back to Cogwheel. I'd love to go to Cogwheel and like have to sneak in and like have to go there and like meet up with his old friends and, you know, some of the old shitheads that he didn't like and everything like that. And just that whole Cogwheel experience, I imagine, would be awesome. Like I'm trying to think of like a game where like you go into a city but you're super hunted, so you've got to kind of like be like really like in the back streets and everything, try not to get caught and stuff like that. But like going into Cogwheel and doing that would be something really, really fun. I think
that the only thing that jumps to mind is kind of almost a sense of Dishonored, which obviously gameplay wise is very different to how we play D&D, but the idea is very similar, which is it's someone who has lived in this world, who is well known in this world, who is forced out of and then has to return to this world, and it's experiencing it from that different perspective of someone who's now on the outside, which can always be quite interesting. Obviously our campaign is taking place quite a way away from kind of the homes of the players. That was something I set into the inception of the campaign. But that's not to say we can't ever go back to Cogwheel, and that's definitely something we can look at as a group, because at the end of the day, whilst I have a story I want to tell, it's a story around what you guys as players really, really want to run and enjoy. Obviously, we've now talked about Geronimo the character, we've talked about you the player, we've talked about lots of different stuff like that. But when you're coming to the character, like we're now 25 sessions in, when you're coming to the character, there are obviously days where people feel low, they don't feel super into it, they just want to sit in a dark room and do nothing. And despite my moaning, we've actually been pretty good and kept really regular times. The party's been mostly together, we've missed the odd person here and there, but really I mean, you especially, I think you've been present for most, if not quite all, of every single session. How do you approach kind of getting into character, or how do you approach just getting into D&D on those days where you sit down and you haven't had a cup of tea in 6 hours and you feel like your eyes are shutting?
I mean, if I haven't had a cup of tea in 6 hours, there's no hope for me, really. So, yeah. No, but in terms of like, I'll take it at two angles. I'll talk about getting into Geronimo and then getting into D&D. I think getting into Geronimo has been the easiest if I'm feeling really bad, because he's just such a maniac. And like he's so positive as well. He's a very positive person that I kind of find myself when I'm kind of like going, "Hey guys, what are we gonna go do now?" I kind of feel better just doing the voice, you know. Mm-hmm. I feel like that's always something. So that's been really nice, especially when like I've been working hard and days have been long and I'm super tired. I'll look forward to D&D and I'll come in and I'll be like, yeah, I'm playing Geronimo today. I feel really happy.
There's a level of catharsis then, kind of into almost putting yourself into the boots of someone else who doesn't have the same problems, who is in a completely different place to you. It's that I suppose losing yourself in an imagination in a world that's not the same as ours.
Yeah, exactly. And then going into sort of D&D in general, I think the idea for me, getting lost in another world is also very big. I remember from last campaign, especially like when it was near the end of our campaign, I remember just loving the setting so much and being so intrigued at what was going on. I spent so many days just like, I want to know what's happening. I'm so excited. And I get the same with obviously this campaign as well. Like, I'm like, I really want to know what's happening. I can't wait for our next adventure. And so getting into D&D for me has always been like, it's not like working or anything. It's just like having fun, like playing with friends, even if we are streaming, it's like having fun playing with friends. Exploring an interesting world, interacting with my buddies, interacting with these NPCs, kicking the crap out some people in some fights and everything. Doesn't matter if they are scripted or not. I'm joking. I'm joking.
You're a liar.
Yeah, going into all these fights, it's just a lot of fun. I think for me it's different though, because I'm quite a positive person in real life anyway. But when I am feeling crap and everything like that, it's just escapism at its finest. And I think because it's just all in the theater of the mind and your imagination is your limit, you can just get lost and just forget everything.
Yeah,
So
and I mean, obviously you brought up a couple of things there, but we've talked about before kind of running the game, and I know I've mentioned to all of my players, and I'm unashamed to say that at any point, if we as a group, if I as a DM, if even one player is like, I really don't want to stream this anymore, I don't want to put this out there, I just want to chill in a private call somewhere where no one can hear and see us, I've always said, we'll just stop. Because at the end of the day, this is meant to be fun for us. This is our downtime. This is our chill time. This is where we go. I know I go after work. You obviously go after work. The others, pretty much everyone is going after work. They've had long days. And so it's definitely something that we always strive to make sure it's something that we just enjoy. And we've been really fortunate that we've never really had any major fallouts with regards to D&D. I know I've been through enough parties that you find in online forums to know that there are some that just don't mesh quite the same way we have. I think it's interesting what you're talking about with the whole kind of that idea of going onto an adventure and finding out what's happening there. I think that's a really important thing that I suppose I wish more people, not necessarily our group, but I wish more people would take into account, is this kind of what's around the next corner. It's that idea. It's that proactive thinking of letting your imagination almost run away with you and trying to imagine where your character can go next, because the trope of the sullen kind of nobody sitting in the corner not talking to anyone is really tiresome and really, really boring, and it doesn't go anywhere. I'll be awful now and without naming anyone, call out a player in another group I'm running. We had a session just the other day, in fact, in which the party had basically behaved in a way that wasn't in line with what I planned, and they needed kind of shoving in a new direction because they were now basically avoiding all of the plot points I'd set out. So I was like, that's fine. I'll turn the table over and I'll do something with it. And I give this big shove and I say, no, you need to go in this direction now. I really put the emphasis on. And one of the players just stops and says, no, I'm not going to go. I'm going to sit here and spend half an hour staring at my circlet. And there was silence for a good 5-10 seconds because I personally was like, wait, what? Like, what?
wait, what?
Yeah, are you stuck on pause? I had to double check. I was like, are you sure? 20 minutes. He's like, yeah, 20 minutes. I'm going to sit here. I was like, the whole party's leaving, and you're going to take 20 minutes to stare at some jewelry. He's like, yeah. I was like, oh my Christ, what is this? What is this? Whereas with our party, and with Geronimo, and obviously you talking about that kind of desire to go out and learn more, that's never been a problem. If I've put a hook down in front of you, almost arguably you've jumped on some of them too viciously.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, because roleplay is such a big part of our party, like we could easily, and I think I don't know whether we did in campaign 1 a lot more, I think, because we got that was obviously near the end of that, but it's starting to happen in campaign 2 now, where we just roleplay heavily with ourselves, like a long time is spent roleplaying and discussing stuff. And I think that was a big part of the reason why we all got together in the first place, was the idea that we loved kind of role-playing and riffing off one another. It was so much fun. And you're right, every time you put down something, like, we're like, oh, we've got to go do it. We've got to go do it. We've got to go do it now. So arguably we go on tangents quite a lot more than maybe we should do. But yeah, I think that's what the thing I love about it, especially I love with Geronimo, is the idea that, like, we'll just be able to talk and just get into stuff for a very, very long time. There'll never be a pause, because we've always got something that we want to discuss and chat about, especially if we really, like, dug our heels into a certain plot point. Like the whole stuff with Argo was near the end, and all of the information with that genie was just blew my mind.
That was really good. I get, like, the only pauses that really pop up, and we've noted this before to some amusement amongst ourselves, is the pauses pop up because we're so very polite. Like, neither one of us wants to talk over each other. No one wants to kind of step in and be like, oh, wait, sorry, no. Everyone's just like, no, you go first. And then we all go silent, waiting for the one person to step forward and say something.
Yeah, that's very true. Very true.
Yeah, so obviously we've talked now about Geronimo, talked about D&D, kind of the inspirations there with running the character, with playing D&D yourself, what you've enjoyed about the campaign, where you hope for it to go. In the campaign itself, Geronimo has started as this criminal on the run, this kind of, as you've mentioned, coward, who is basically just fleeing this situation he's set up and has fallen in with these strangers who he's now grown very close to. where do you see him ending up? Is this something that you envision him changing behavior-wise? Is this for you a story of growth and development of that kind of slightly more heroic meta plot where Geronimo steps up? Or is Geronimo one of these anti-heroes, or even just a generic person who really in your mind is going to kind of not fail to hit the mark, but is someone who's going to come through all of this and really have learned very, very little?
I think I'm fairly biased. I want all my characters to eventually become heroes. Is kind of the idea. It doesn't matter whether or not they live to enjoy the heroism or the reputation, or whether they're just, I don't know, sort of like do something and are kind of unremarked. That's the thing I liked about Ashton from last campaign, is that he kind of like they managed to stop the terrible things from happening, and although he lived, people I'm sure may have remembered him for some time. He was never like remarked one, but he was still a hero, and I like that. And I think for Geronimo, my idea is that I would like to see some change. I would like for him to eventually not be a coward, and kind of like to step up to maybe save the party, save his friends, maybe save Cogwheel. But in reality, like I feel like the end goal for me as Geronimo is I would love to see Geronimo like end the campaign having sort of like maybe save the world and kind of put it on with the party, obviously, but then kind of like going back and sort of like regulating technology, regulating, firearms and stuff like that, and kind of like building up as a business to kind of like protect people from monsters and protect people from bandits and stuff like that, rather than sort of like as weapons for war. That kind of how I imagine is the company that he was making for wants to sell them to the next nation so that the nations can fight and have a stronger and gain more through conquest. And what I want to see Geronimo do is like regulate that for kind of like, I don't know, sort of maybe not bounty hunters, but for nations to kind of like protect their, defeat evil, defeat monsters, defeat, kind of like terrible beings, and kind of develop technology that way. And that's kind of what I want to see as some sort of like, I don't know, maybe not the technomancer of Cogwheel, but along those lines is sort of like how I see his end story.
Well, you clearly see him as remaining incredibly idealistic. Sorry to butt in there, but like obviously, as we mentioned, the foundation of Geronimo's story, and we kind of touched upon it, but we can now be very explicit, is that Geronimo was being forced into a position to do something that he thought was evil. He thought he was developing what was originally a tool meant to help miners, meant to have kind of industrial applications, being morphed and changed in front of him into a weapon that would lead to great suffering, and he stole it and ran away, and that was entirely based on his moral position. And what you're saying here is that you actually want him to be able to go back and to be able to spread that moral position. You want him to be able to impose that idealistic vision of the future, where he himself is responsible for saving those who might before have been in great suffering because of his work.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think ideals are really important to Geronimo, and I think the cowardice part is just, I think, his insecurities of not being able to actually feel. He feels like he's powerless in that sense, and he was really. That's why he did the only thing he could do with the power that he had, which was to take gun and run. If you excuse the sort of rhyming there, but he had to leave, and that was the only thing he could do. And when he comes back, having trained and practiced and fought and leveled up, as it were, eventually with whatever big bad we end up facing in the future, and whatever the culmination of the campaign is, I imagine that would be his sort of outro in sort of regulating technology. That would be the ideal. Obviously, it might change. It might completely change over the next sort of like 50, 100, whatever, however many sessions we do to get to the end point. It may completely and totally change. Maybe somebody warps his opinion and he wants to use it to kind of like be a conqueror or whatever. I don't know. But I think in my mind, at least at this stage, Geronimo wants to keep to those ideals, to spread that moral compass, to avoid basically like mass bloodshed, which you can see happen, and which I suppose he's technically taking part in the way that he's used tank/gun, and go from there, really, basically.
Yeah, and I think that's really nice. And I like the fact that obviously you and the other players are the same, but obviously we're talking to you at the moment. But you approach your character as something that is organic, that can change. And we as a group have obviously talked a lot about the fact that We're role players first and not game players. When we play D&D, we like the system, we like the combat. It's fun. It is intuitive. It has its issues, but we also have some rules to cover those. But at the heart, we're role players, and we like telling stories. And I've always said one of my favorite things about this group is I, as a GM, can set up a situation, drop you in it, and I can sit back for half an hour, sometimes up to an hour, and you guys are just riffing off of each other. I may not need to say a word, and you have plots you want to discuss, you have ideas that you're getting between, and in some instances that pace is still fine because it's where you guys feel comfortable, everyone's engaged, and it's working. And Geronimo is one of those characters that obviously is intrinsic to creating that feeling. We've been going for just over about 40 minutes now, and obviously this isn't going to be a full session. In fact, I want to wrap up well before an hour. But just the last couple of things to go over. One of them is, when making a character, what's your advice for doing that? Because whilst there are some kind of methods, generally speaking, that lots of people go through at the same time, like when we made characters, we did so together. Everyone comes up with their character in a slightly different way, or everyone has different things they prioritize. Where would you place the priority in creating a compelling, interesting character that you want to do 100, 200 sessions with?
I honestly think that the best way to make a character, at least in my opinion, sort of that's as an easiest way, is to think, when you're thinking of that character concept, is to base it off one idea. And I think the first thing that came to my head, at least when I was thinking about Geronimo, was the pastry idea, and was the idea that Geronimo loved pastries, and that one of his ideal situations would be to set up a pastry shop. Like, that was like his end goal. And I thought it was so funny, the idea of basically having, obviously before the class and everything like that, was to have the idea of this character, this gnome, said it wanting to set up a pastry shop and his love of pastries. And that, for me, fleshed him out enough for me to do it. So I think it's just take one trait, like one thing you can just work with, because that, for me, when I came up with the rest of it, was just like, in terms of at least the role play side of characters. I mean, obviously, if you're making a D&D character, I'd start with class first and foremost, and then obviously race. But if you're looking for an actual concept on like how to actually flesh out or make that character be a character, if you think of that one trait, that one thing that's affecting, like love of pastries, the rest kind of comes off from there. Like, it was that set the tone for his just silliness. Yeah, the
central personality pillar that you kind of build the rest of the House of Geronimo around. That grows out of who he is and what he does. Okay, no, that was really, really interesting, and obviously I'm really grateful for you taking the time to sit down and chat to me. This obviously is one more stream on our little journey up to affiliate. We are doing a couple more. So this was our first kind of the idea behind. We're going to be doing hopefully a lot more, not nearly as often as we have our regular streams, but we're aiming for about 2 a month or so. Just little extra bits that obviously we'll throw up onto YouTube, but also just interesting kind of D&D creation points. We're starting with the characters, since that is kind of the most direct thing that people might recognize. The most common reason people jump on our stream is they see our art, which we obviously love. It's the reason we picked it. But we have a few more characters coming up. I haven't managed to book in everyone, but obviously we have the stream tomorrow for the regular session, which we'll hope to obviously see everyone at. Then on Thursday, I've got Jared, who's going to come and discuss Baron, covering some of the same points, but with some slightly different questions. And then on Sunday, I've got Jensen, who is going to be talking about Durgus. And I think amongst those 3 characters, we're going to have some really interesting different perspectives, firstly on just creating characters, but also just on the characters themselves, because those 3 individuals are very different characters. Other than these extra streams, it's just a reminder that we obviously have Discord, we have some social medias, they've been flashing in the bottom left there for you. There are some links down below for you to go and find those or join them. We have a new track that's come in for kind of the background music, if you've been able to hear that tonight, and please go and look up that, because again, royalty-free music, it also sounds quite nice, and it's made it feel a bit homely. And finally, just kind of a thank you for those of you who are listening, and I hope to see you in the proper campaign. And obviously, thank you, Jake, for having a quick chat with me about Geronimo.
No problem, my pleasure.
Perfect. Okay, we're probably not going to do a raid tonight because there's only a couple of people, but tomorrow we will do our big raid. We'll have as many people as we can get, and we'll throw them onto another channel. But for now, I hope everyone has a fantastic night, and I will see all of you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye.